You hear about freak athletes and football fans using the term greatest of all time. Calling James Nathaniel Brown a GOAT is definitely a understatement. Jim Brown was your favorite running back's inspiration. He was your granddad's father favorite running back. You ever heard of a man named Barry Sanders? Well, William Sanders, who is Barry Sanders' dad, considered Jim Brown as one of the greatest football players who ever picked up a football. Now that's saying a lot. To get started, on February 17, 1963, in St. Simon's Islands, Georgia, Jim Brown was born. Jim Brown, dad, basically, he was a professional fighter, but he did not stay and help raise Jim. He just ran off, unfortunately, which left the responsibility to Jim Brown's mother and his grandmother. Jim Brown's mother was a homemaker, so which means that basically she helped clean houses or clean houses, people's houses, mainly white folks back in those days. When work was drying up and they needed to put food on the table, Jim Brown's mother was a hustler, so she was like, I got to make some more money. So what she did was end up going towards the East Coast to New York. Jim Brown ended up staying with his grandmother. So during that time, his grandmother helped raise him during that time. Now, when he was getting older, toward his teenage years, his mother called for him to come live with her in New York, and that's what happened. He ended up enrolling at Manhasset High School in New York. He was a dominant athlete, of course. Jim lettered in football, baseball, lacrosse, and running, and he ran track. His senior year of high school, he became a legendary athlete already. And he had good grades to go with it. So he wasn't just a dumb jock. This is a very intelligent man or young man during this time. So he wasn't illiterate. He was very intelligent. Now, even though Jim was a beast of an athlete that nobody ever seen before and very intelligent, this is the 1950s. So back in them days, they don't care if you was Jesus and you were black, you not coming to their school. That's just how it was back in those days. And but a good friend basically told Syracuse, if you don't recruit this young man, you guys are idiots. And Jim Brown ended up going to Syracuse. They had no choice but to compromise. Now, Jim, of course, um, had a legendary career at Syracuse. So Jim Brown is considered, just playing across at Syracuse, to be one of the greatest lacrosse players ever. And I say that to say this: he didn't just play football; he played basketball. He was like again. He translated his legendary status from high school, and he brought it to college. So he was a good athlete in basketball. He was a good athlete in lacrosse. Now, excuse me for saying the word good. He was great. The man was great. Uh, he was a legendary, of course, as we know, football player. Jim basically is considered one of the greatest athletes to step on the campus of Syracuse to this day. So, not to mention going back to lacrosse, Jim was so dominant in lacrosse They had to end up changing the rule in lacrosse. Basically, if you ever played lacrosse before, to this day, you have to keep the stick in a constant motion when carrying the ball. Back in those days, you could hold it close to your body, and that's what Jim did. And because of Jim, he changed that. So you ever heard of that term? If you change rules in a sport, then you're great. Jim was one of those greats. So not only is he in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the College Football Hall of Fame, he isn't in the Lacrosse Hall of Fame. I mean, you can't touch this man, man. This just dominant in everything he does. Dominant. Now, after being dominant in all the sports in Syracuse, basketball, football, especially lacrosse, he was drafted to the Cleveland Browns after his senior year in 1957. Now, just to give you a close recap on his career, he had a 9-year career with the Cleveland Browns, and and he led the league in rushing for 8 years. So only 1 year he did not lead the league in rushing. That's how dominant this man was, ladies and gentlemen. To this day, he still holds the record for the Cleveland Browns for the all-time rushing yards. He was the first player ever to rush over 10,000 yards. Now, his career NFL rushing record was broken by the great Walter Payton. And now, after, of course, years later, he's now 11th on that list. Now, if you look at that list now, the 10 that is past him are great running backs, and of course with a couple of rule changes, but that's for another day. But these are great running backs, ladies and gentlemen. But he was, I mean, he was the original Marshawn Lynch. He was the original Larry Zonka. Um, just that type of power back with speed, like an Adrian Peterson or Marshawn Lynch, or you know, um, John Riggins. If going back to power, but that power again, that power back with speed, Jamal Lewis. He was the original. He was the original. He was the king. So it's 1966. He's 30 years old, still fairly in his prime, meaning there's no signs of him slowing down. He didn't have any serious injuries that, you know, show tread on his tires. He's still dominating people. He had gotten into acting, and Art Modell during that time had told him, if you didn't report to training camp, I'm going to fine you. But Jim stood his ground and closed the chapter on his football career. So he did not go back to the Cleveland Browns. So in 1966, he officially retired from the Cleveland Browns in the National Football League. Jim wasn't just an actor, he was also a big factor in the civil rights movement. He was one of the few black athletes to speak on racial issues in the 1950s. In 1967, Brown was involved with the likes of Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Carl Stokes, all members of the Cleveland Summit. They were behind Muhammad Ali, who was very vocal on not going to Vietnam and fighting a war when blacks were fighting a war every day in America. We also know about that legendary night in Miami at the Hampton House Motel on February 25th, 1964, were under one roof, not yet converted is Muslim Cassius Clay, Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, and Malcolm X were all under one roof talking about black issues. Now, like I mentioned before, Jim Brown was good friends with Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. And on that night, matter of fact, there's a movie that describes that night on February 25th, 1964, like I just said, called One Night in Miami. It was directed and created by Regina King, which she did a wonderful job. Homegirl did a wonderful job on that movie. I think it was very slept on. It was uh, made in 2020, but it was a very good movie. If you have Amazon Prime, uh, I suggest you go watch that movie if you're interested. It was a very good movie. And again, old Jimmy Brown kept on doing movies as like the Dirty Dozens, and going toward the 80s and 90s. The set, of course. How can I skip the 70s with the black exploitation movies? You know, he he did his thing acting. Um, on the right side, the pics that I'm showing is two of my favorite movies that Jim Brown was in. The one at the top right um, is a movie called Original Gangsters with Fred Williamson and Pam Grier um, and a whole bunch of. It's one of my favorite movies. It was maybe in the '90s. As you can see, he's a little older there, and of course, Any Given Sunday with Jamie Foxx, and you see him besides LT and um, uh, other very good actors. I love that movie with those movies with Jim Brown. Now going to now going toward the late '80s, going into the '90s, Jim Brown created a program called the Mirror I Can program to help black youth and other minorities, if you want to call them that. I'm sorry, guys, I hate that word. Living in the gang riddled areas of LA and Inglewood, California. So basically, he helped the youth living in those areas with social skills and how they can conduct themselves like gentlemen and young ladies, and basically, how to stay out of trouble, basically. Uh, Also, one thing a lot of people don't know is, or a lot of people in California in those areas know, but those who were outside on the outside looking in during that time didn't know Jim Brown also helped um uh was part of the 1992 troops with the Bloods and the Crips, so he helped uh them squash beats at that time. So I mean, Jim Brown, he could have sat on his ass, and with his already legendary, you know, um, resume, he didn't. He was very active in his community. Well, this was my tribute to Jim Brown, or James Nathaniel Brown. Like I said, he was your granddad's daddy, favorite running back. I just felt like I had to do a tribute my way, the best way I could. Um, those who know football, fans of football, fan of the running back position, know how legendary this man was. And as a black man, you have no choice but to admire him being a man and standing up being vocal when it was not fashionable for black men to do that during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So, um, rest in peace, King. We gonna miss you. We definitely took a blow, not just in the sports world, but just the black community in general. Rest in power.